Hello and welcome to the Education for Justice Global podcast series. My name is Paul Janovic and I work with the Global Firearms Program of the UNODC. Higher education plays a crucial role in advancing the SDGs. We hope that many of you will join the Education for Justice initiative by starting teaching on topics covered by our university modules. Today, we will initiate a discussion about the criminal role and the impact of firearms together with senior lecturers Simon Snedden and Nick Cartwright. Dr. Simon Snedden is the program leader for Master's degree in Law at the University of Northampton. He has been teaching at undergraduate and postgraduate levels for about 20 years, and he has a particular focus on organized crime and terrorism. Nick Cartwright is a senior lecturer in law and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy with over 20 years' experience in teaching law in the UK and abroad. Nick believes in promoting justice through education, and he is currently using the E4J materials in his teaching and during his works with social justice groups and human rights organizations in England and Northern Ireland. Simon and Nick teach postgraduate modules on firearms crime, which were developed from the E4J firearms modules. So Simon, firearms issues are often understated, and in most cases the weapon is usually seen simply as an accessory to crime. But actually firearms play several important roles in the crime world. What can you tell us about these roles?
Firearms are used by organised criminal groups for a number of reasons, and the impact of their use in the criminal world must not be underestimated. In a 2010 report, the UNODC outlined three main reasons why criminal groups use firearms. Firstly, firearms are used to facilitate violent crimes. This can be done directly, where the firearm is used for the commission of an offence, armed robbery for example. It can also be done indirectly, as carrying a firearm projects an aura of power on the criminals in the eyes of others. Most people are unable to tell at a glance a replica firearm from a genuine firearm, or a loaded one from an unloaded one, and so the added impact of carrying a firearm, even with no intention of direct use, can be dramatic. There is also gradation between these two categories, for example when a firearm is carried and discharged into the air rather than directly at the victim. Secondly, firearms are used as tools for gaining and maintaining power. This may be something as straightforward as controlling a specific geographical territory, such as the control of particular areas in Naples by the Casalesi clan of the Camorra, or criminal groups' control of specific favela areas in Sao Paulo in Brazil, or it may be a wider, less well-defined geographical area. For those groups who've evolved beyond specific geographical areas and instead control a particular commodity or commodities, firearms are still used to project and maintain power, both with other groups, causing an arms race of sorts, but also within the group, where access to better firearms is seen as one of the perks of promotion. Thirdly, when firearms are not being used by groups, they can be traded for other commodities, either legal or illegal. Because historically the international community has often not carried out post-conflict disarmament very effectively, it can be easy for groups to acquire firearms with a view to future trade. Studies in South America, for example, suggest that the exchange of cocaine for firearms was a common practice for drugs cartels in the early part of the 21st century, both as a way of rearming and as a way of avoiding anti-money laundering measures. Finally, the presence of illegally held firearms in a particular area serves to destabilize the area more widely. The Small Arms Survey found a link between the presence of armed organised criminal groups in the Balkans and the high rates of non-organised crime firearms incidents. Organised criminality thrives on instability, and while there's no suggestion that groups deliberately flood an area with firearms with the sole purpose of destabilising it, they're quite happy to reap the benefit of law enforcement teams being distracted by general criminality. It's important to bear in mind that these classifications are extremely fluid, and a firearm may be used for different reasons at different times. It could start as a status symbol, but if used may be traded with another group in an attempt to avoid the sophisticated forensic and ballistic tracing which is available to police forces.
Well, thank you Simon for this explanation on the roles of firearms in the criminal world. Nevertheless, we understand that most of the time firearms are actually legally produced and further traded on the legal market. Yet, a huge amount of these firearms end in the hands of criminals. How does it happen?
Very few firearms are illegal from their production, you're absolutely right, and there are several ways they can become illegal. Mostly this is within the overarching idea of diversion. Firstly, diversion through change of destination. As I touched on earlier, any failure in post-conflict disarmament means that firearms which were bought legally by a state or even acquired on the shady grey market are able to enter the criminal realm freely. The death of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, for example, was followed almost immediately by footage of pickup trucks full of firearms heading towards insurgents in Mali. And many of these firearms were subsequently used against both civilians and governments. In addition, and as the national regulations on firearms ownership is not globally consistent, criminal groups are able to transfer weapons from jurisdictions where they can be purchased and owned legally to those where such ownership is illegal. Secondly, diversion through change of property. Individual firearms or groups of firearms may be stolen by criminal groups, either as part of more general burglaries and housebreakings, or specifically targeted. For example, earlier this year, 10 handguns, 2 rifles and a quantity of ammunition were stolen from a fishing and hunting store in Tennessee, and the US Bureau of Justice Studies estimated that over 250,000 firearms are stolen annually in the United States during burglaries, and up to 80% of those are not recovered 6 months after the burglary. It may also seem surprising, but a large number of firearms are recorded as being lost every year. Some of these are genuinely mislaid by the owners and never turn up, but others have been given or traded to criminal groups. Also within this category are firearms which are improperly or incompletely destroyed in an official destruction campaign. Instead of the entire weapon being destroyed, only parts of it are, and these are usually the easiest parts to replace, and what's left is then sold on to a criminal group. Finally, and a relatively small category, the continual evolution of legislation may make firearms which were purchased and owned legally now illegal. For example, in 2019, the US Department of Justice's ban on bump stocks came into force, and anyone who had not destroyed their bump stock or given it to the ATF became a criminal overnight, liable to a large fine or imprisonment. It seems entirely likely that some of the bump stocks were passed on from the legitimate owners to criminal groups. The final category is diversion through change of functionality. Firearms which have been deactivated or made so that they're incapable of firing live ammunition can be reactivated by criminal groups.
Right, but can you give us some examples?
This appears to be what happened in the Charlie Hebdo shooting in Paris, where the firearms were purchased legally in Slovakia as deactivated blank firing guns and reactivated by a criminal group before getting to France. Last year, in Operation Alps, the Spanish Policía Nacional, with help from Europol, arrested who they believed to be the key member of a reactivation and illegal firearms parts trafficking network stretching as far as the United States. In addition, Operation Portu saw the seizure of 10,000 assault rifles and other firearms, which were either improperly deactivated or live firing. And Operation Bosphorus dismantled at least 4 workshops in Spain for illegally converting gas pistols to live firing pistols and made over 200 arrests across Europe. All 3 of these operations involved national police forces and Europol, and this emphasises the importance of cooperation. Once a firearm enters the criminal realm, it can be used by criminal groups for a number of reasons, as I outlined earlier.
Diversion plays a major role in moving firearms from licit to illicit markets. But at a smaller scale, there are also illegally produced firearms. Nick, what can you tell us about this illicit production?
As Simon has just said, most illicit firearms start life as legal firearms, and illicit production has therefore always been relatively small scale, which is why in much of the literature these are often referred to as craft or artisan weapons. Most sources agree that these craft firearms make up only about 3% of illegally held firearms. Some of these are produced on the fringes of the legal trade, others in illegal factories. Some are made on a smaller scale by gunsmiths, and some are fabricated using technology such as 3D printing. There are factories that produce firearms and markets that sell directly to the public in some countries where arms are produced on an industrial scale. For example, Dara Adam Khel in Pakistan has had a thriving arms industry since before Pakistan gained independence. Whilst licenses are still needed to purchase these firearms legally, there are media reports suggesting that licensing laws are often overlooked and there is a thriving trade in illicit firearms. There are also factories which operate entirely outside of the law. We know about some of these because they have been discovered and closed down by law enforcement agencies. For example, in 2011, Ecuadorian law enforcement agents closed down a weapons factory in Quito, which it was claimed was supplying arms to the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, better known as FARC. In countries where skilled gunsmiths still operate on a meaningful scale, handmade weapons are more common. Some academics have reported on a parallel gun economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Jeff Stocker reported that blacksmiths and farmers across sub-Saharan Africa are increasingly moving away from the production or repair of farming implements, tools or automobile parts and into the assembly, restoration, modification and sale of firearms. The proliferation of this activity has had a destabilising effect on the region and supported insurrectionaries, guerrillas and global organised criminal groups. The Small Arms Survey report that claims that artisan producers in Ghana are now crafting assault rifles. Larger and often cruder handmade weapons are also not uncommon. During the period known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, produced numerous mortars, and a large number of single-use rockets are claimed to have been produced in Palestine. Ammunition, though, is harder to craft outside of factories, and it is more common for this to be produced by recycling spent shell cases.
Thank you, Nick. But what about the new technologies? With the current access to relatively cheap computers, 3D printers, and computer numeric control machines, almost anyone can produce firearms and components at home. Is there a real possibility of a dangerous trend?
CNC machines can cut materials to a design programmed into a standard computer, and 3D printers can print components, and both are widely and cheaply available. This means that in order to make a firearm in a domestic setting, you just need access to a design, and these can be shared online. There are even companies that have produced and sold the blueprints of 3D guns and gone to court to argue this is legal. However, it is illegal in most countries to download the plans. Law enforcement agents in the Swedish city of Malmö have seized several guns which they believe were produced by scanning parts of a dismantled firearm, uploading the scans to a computer, and then 3D printing the individual components to create a new firearm. Some of these firearms were complex weapons similar to the Czech submachine gun, known popularly as the Scorpion. Such guns don't have the serial numbers that law enforcement agencies use for tracing and control, and it's impossible to know how many of these so-called ghost guns are in circulation. Plastic components are also more difficult to detect than metal, which also poses problems for law enforcement. However, there are successes. For example, in 2019, Tendai Muswaya was convicted of possessing 3D printed firearms components in Southwark Crown Court, London, England. He was sentenced to a 3-year custodial sentence. According to the prosecution, Tendai only needed to fabricate steel cylinders to line the plastic barrels, and he would have had a fully functional firearm made entirely by following instructions he'd been able to find online. The Hull synagogue shooting on the 9th of October 2019 is probably the most infamous incident involving a 3D printed gun. It demonstrates the risks of a dangerous trend posed by these new technologies. Like with other craft firearms, ammunition still poses the biggest obstacle to those who wish to use these types of weapons, though.
We've talked about the issues of illicit firearms. What can you tell us about the various responses in the various fields to these firearms issues?
Thanks, Paul. The criminal justice response to these issues are at different levels. There are international laws on firearms as well as regional and domestic ones. There are also mechanisms that have been put in place by international organisations like the UNODC that encourage and facilitate the cooperation between nation states to combat the illicit and illegal trade-in and use of firearms. Whilst the United Nations Convention Against Organised Crime, known as UNTOC, is the only legal basis for international cooperation in the context of firearms, the Firearms Protocol and the International Tracing Instrument create pressure on states to cooperate because of the legal force of UNTOC. An example of this would be the exchange of information under Article 13 of the Firearms Protocol. The European Union's Working Party on Conventional Arms Export, known as COARM, is a clear example of good practice under this article. European Union member states share information on the denials of permission to export conventional firearms. This presents multiple applications to export from the single market, and by sharing the reasons for denial, has aided the development of a common policy towards export licenses. The International Tracing Instrument, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2005, has made tracing of firearms much more systematic. However, the different ways states record and store data on firearms has been an impediment to international cooperation, and there is still no international equivalent system for tracing ammunition. Prevention of firearms being diverted to illicit and illegal use has to remain the first priority of criminal justice responses, but they also need to detect, investigate and ultimately remove these firearms from circulation. I believe that international cooperation remains the most powerful tool in combating the illicit and illegal use of firearms. This will require nation states to work together in ensuring legislation is compatible and information can be shared in a usable format. Procedural reforms at national, regional and international level are still needed, and more effort and resource needs to go into ensuring that enforcement agencies have the capacity to investigate and prosecute. National and regional legislatures need to ensure that laws are updated in line with the relevant international instruments, and whilst the Firearms Protocol has within its statement of purpose a clear commitment to promoting, facilitating and strengthening international cooperation, this does not always happen in practice. Further, key international instruments, such as the Arms Trade Treaty, have been criticised for making limited reference to international cooperation. To assist states in the development of national legal frameworks, the UNODC publishes model laws on many aspects of its work.
Thanks, Nick. Simon, what is your opinion?
There are a number of stages, I think, in tackling the illegal trade in firearms. Firstly, I think it's very important that we encourage tighter controls on civilian ownership of firearms, for the very easy reason that if there are fewer firearms in circulation, it'll be harder for criminal groups to access them. Secondly, and closely linked, I think, states need to do a lot more to enforce and comply with the Firearms Protocol, the Arms Trade Treaty, and the various regional and national legislation which Nick touched on. This will reduce the opportunity for criminal groups to move criminal weapons.
Thanks, Simon. I think you make some really valuable points about international cooperation, and of course prevention has to be the main aim. As you know, though, education is also vital, ensuring that people understand the risks and consequences of firearms. A shift in public attitude so that the scale of the threat posed by firearms is understood is important in ensuring that governments give the issue the attention and the resourcing it needs. Education as a tool for law enforcement has been underutilised the world over, yet I've seen firsthand the positive effect of education in peace building in both Northern Ireland and the Balkans. Promoting the aims of the Doha Declaration through a concerted education programme offers real hope of promoting a culture of lawfulness.
You're absolutely right, Nick. Education is really important. Having been teaching in this area for several years, I wish I had had access to a resource like E4J when I was starting out. It's a fantastic initiative, and the quality and range of material available is truly impressive. Tackling firearms crime will not be a quick or easy solution, though, but that doesn't mean we should not keep trying.
This concludes our episode for today. I'm sure we were able to set the ground for future and deeper discussions on the firearms issue. I would like to thank both Nick and Simon for joining us, and we invite you to follow our future episodes where we will get more into details on specific firearms topics. Higher Education Matters and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime is proudly partnering with hundreds of universities from around the world to advance the SDGs. The Education for Justice initiative is part of the global program for the implementation of the Doha Declaration funded by the State of Qatar. Tune in for the next episode of this E4J Global Podcast series that will be published soon on our E4J platform. In order not to miss any of our new podcasts or opportunities for higher education institutions, please register yourself at our Education for Justice platform. Let's inspire change together.